Hey, this is Stefan from Only Comic Books. Been a fan of the Comics Alternative for a while now, and appreciate the stellar quality. Hopefully my Patreon support can contribute to a new trade.
This is the Comics Alternative, episode 162, a review of 6 recent #1 issues. Hello and welcome to another episode of the Comics Alternative. I'm Derek.
And I'm Andy, and we're two guys with PhDs talking about comics.
And on this episode, Andy and I are going to get caught up with some recent #1 issues. We're going to begin with the first and second issue of the new series from Brian K. Vaughan and Cliff Chiang, Paper Girls. After that, we're going to move on to Majorie Liu and Senna Takita's Monstrous. Then it's The Goddamned, written by Jason Aaron and drawn by R.M. Guerra. We move on from there to Claws by Grant Morrison and Dan Mora. Then Snowblind from Ollie Masters and Tyler Jenkins. And then we wrap up with a Dynamite title, James Bond #1, written by Warren Ellis and art by Jason Masters. But before we get to that long and involved discussion, we want to let all of you guys know that this episode of the Comics Alternative is brought to you by those wonderful folks at Discount Comic Book Service. Go to their website, dcbservice.com, for all of your comics pre-ordering needs. There you'll find all DC, Marvel, Image, and Dark Horse titles at 40% off of the cover price if you pre-order. For all of the other publishers, you'll see that those discounts are 20 to 35% off cover price, and every single month you're going to find some unbelievable specials. Sometimes those specials are at 45% off cover price, sometimes 50% off cover price, but often the discounts go higher from there.
And you've come to expect great bundles from DCB Service, and November is no exception. Actually, we've got a nice little war going on between Marvel and DC. Marvel's got a great bundle. DC's got a great bundle. Marvel's got a really cool relaunch bundle that's 50% off, and DC has a new miniseries bundle, which is also out. Actually, they're stepping it up. The DC bundle is 52% off. I wonder if that 52 has any significance, Derek.
You think?
Maybe. We also have a great Vertigo bundle, the 12 newest Vertigo titles for 50% off, and a Valiant bundle, the 7 newest Valiant issues for 50% off.
You can't beat those specials, but then again, we say this every single month because it's Discount Comic Book Service. Go to their website, dcbservice.com, for all of your comics pre-ordering needs. And after you do pre-order your comics there, please be sure to send them an email and tell them that the two guys with PhDs sent you.
Yeah, they would like to hear that. We would like for you to do that.
And in fact, that's a pretty good segue into something that I wanted to point out, Andy. Now we have a really full show ahead of us. We're looking at 6 #1 issues. But before we get into that, I want to share some listener mail that we've received.
Cool.
Mail time.
Ooh, the mail's here. That means we get to see our old friend, Mailbox.
We have a letter. We had an email the other day from Bob Hodges. Now, listeners of the podcast should recognize that name because Bob has contacted us for a while. He is a devoted listener, and every now and again he'll drop us a line to tell us something that he's reading or thank us or comment on something that he's heard on the show. Also, it's worth mentioning that, I don't know if you remember, Andy, a few years ago when we used to do our on-location shows at what used to be Lone Star Comics in the Dallas area, my local shop. Now it's turned into Collected. But for a while, we were doing monthly giveaways. Bob was one of the first winners of a giveaway.
Oh, yeah. I do remember some of those giveaways.
And if I'm not mistaken, I think he may have won. What did he win? I can't remember if it was him or Sean Kleefeld that won the Klingon gun, but Bob was one of the winners. And so he's been listening to the show for a while. But I mention him in terms of in-stock trades because he sends us an email, and he writes, first, if you need an ammunition to keep in-stock trades as a sponsor, I'm happy to testify that I've made a couple of orders off their website in the last year and a half because of your folks' show. I have a couple of great local shops here in Seattle that I like to support, but when I can't find stuff, I go to their website. So that's great. I emailed Bob back and I said, hey, why don't you email the In-Stock Trade and Discount Comic Book Service people directly and let them know that.
Yeah.
So, but then he goes on. He says, second, and this relates to you, Andy. He said, second, I really enjoyed the New Deal and your interview with Jonathan Case.
Oh, that's nice.
Mm-hmm. And this is also rather timely because he's mentioning here a title that we're going to reference in a little while. He says, third, if you talked a while back about not knowing how to approach Scalped in teaching. And in fact, the context there is that with a longer series like that, where do you start or where do you leave off? And, ongoing series are a little more difficult, multi-volume series to teach in the classroom. But he goes on, he says, I don't normally use comics in my teaching, but I did teach a composition course that featured a unit on Pine Ridge Reservation, which included the documentary Incident at Ogallala, a chapter from Chris Hedges and Joe Sacco's Days of Destruction, Days of Revolt, the first scalp trade paperback, and more or less standalone issues 24 and 35 of Scalped. I'm not a big fan of the first arc of Scalped, but I think it evolved into an all-time great series, and in the course we discussed how the single issues expanded the scope and perspective of the series. And then Bob wraps up by saying, anyway, you guys keep up the good work. I'm glad you and Shay started the monthly manga show.
Oh, that's great.
So, with that one email, Bob is spreading the love all around the Comics Alternative family.
Yeah, Bob, we really appreciate that and really appreciate you sharing how you use a lot of those titles and going into detail. I mean, that's really cool that you're number one, enjoying those titles, and number two, that able to use those in such a way. That's great.
Mm-hmm. And then one other thing, dealing with our listeners, and in fact, a listener who is also a creator. We have someone else who just recently started to support us on Patreon, and this is William Ibanez. And again, if listeners recognize that name, well, it should sound familiar because a few months ago, Kunka and I discussed William's Blazing Quantum on the podcast. So he has now become a supporter of the Comics Alternative. So, William, thank you very much for supporting us on Patreon.
Yeah, thanks a lot, William. We certainly appreciate it.
Exactly. And, if you guys listen to the show on a regular basis and want to get in on the fun, then you can become Patreon supporters of us as well. So you can go to www.patreon.com/comicsalternative, or if you just go to our website, comicsalternative.com, you cannot miss the links to our Patreon account. So whether you support us for $1, $5, $15 gets you quite a bit. Any little bit helps. So we appreciate the people who support us. And check it out if you haven't already.
Yeah.
So Andy, you ready to get into a discussion of the titles that we're looking at this week?
Yeah, let's hit these number ones.
So we're going to start with, I guess, the oldest of the number ones, a series that already has a issue number 2 out, and this is Paper Girls, written by Brian K. Vaughan and with art by Cliff Chang. Now, Andy and I, quote-unquote, agonized on whether to include Paper Girl in this discussion because when we were deciding that we wanted to look at number 1 issues, Paper Girls number 2 had just been released or was about to be released. And it's like, well, we want to look at recent number 1s with discount, but we decided to include it because we just couldn't miss out on a title written by Brian K. Vaughan.
Absolutely. And, when we interviewed Vaughn back in, I guess that was January.
Yeah.
He mentioned this title. He couldn't tell us an awful lot about it, so it's really great to have this come out.
Yes. So, before we get into the nitty gritty of Paper Girls, maybe a little more about the context of why we chose to look at number one issues. And this is something, Andy, you and I were discussing when several weeks ago when we were planning on what would we read for this week's show. Lately, whether it's been you and me, or me and Kunka, or Gene, or Gwen, on the regular shows, I've noticed lately we have been doing many more books, like trade collections, original graphic novels, archival collections, than we have single issues. I think that's a trend for 2015, in fact, and I'll probably point that out again at our end of the year show. But, you and I were talking about how we felt that we were kind of missing out on some of the number one issues. I know I have felt that way with all of these books taking my attention, especially for the podcast, that it was time to devote one episode just to single issues.
Yeah, and I agree, Derek, and I think you and I kind of have the same, or have kind of evolved into the same buying patterns. I don't buy as many single issues as I used to. And I think that you've probably cut back a little bit, too, from just some conversations that we've had.
Yeah.
So this is a nice opportunity for me to see some of the single issues that I really have been missing out on for quite a while.
Mm-hmm. And there's a lot. And one of the ones that I was most excited about looking at for this week, all of them I was excited about, but this one stood out on top because it was Brian K. Vaughan. So now we have the first two issues of Paper Girls out. How would you describe this to the uninitiated?
Well, this is a sort of a tribute to the 1980s. This story takes place in the late 80s in a town called Stony Stream, Ohio. And it starts out with a kind of unusual scene that maybe we'll get to in a moment. But basically, this is a story about a girl named Erin, and she has a new paper route. And that paper route starts, Derek, is it on Halloween night, or is it the morning after? It's the morning after, right?
Well, it's early in that
early.
next morning, right?
Yeah. So she's starting her new paper route, but there are other girls on the paper route. A girl named Mac, who is kind of a tough girl. Has been doing the paper route for a while. Tiffany, an African-American girl, and a girl named KJ, who carries around a hockey stick. And they find, again, without getting into too much, they find that there's some really odd things going on around town that really don't have anything to do with Halloween, or maybe they do.
That's right. We're not exactly sure what the mysteries are. And with these first two issues, and, you don't expect, or I don't expect especially, anything less from Brian K. Vaughan. I mean, the pacing of these two issues and the way that he sets up this mystery. There's one that is revealed at the tail end of the first issue, and then there's another really good cliffhanger at the end of the second. And I think that it is what we find at the end of this first issue. Now, I don't think it would be a spoiler to mention what Erin discovers for a couple reasons. One, this first issue's been out for well over a month now, but also I've been hearing other people talk about this reveal at the end of issue number one. So do you think we should mention it?
Yeah, I think we could mention that. It's pretty safe, and it really doesn't tell you that much.
Right, exactly. So what happens is that when Erin, Mackenzie, Tiffany, and KJ are out, they have an encounter with these hooded figures, and at first they think that they are just trick-or-treaters who are hanging out late causing problems. One of them has taken Tiffany's walkie-talkie, and that's important to Tiffany as well as to the team of girls because they use it on their paper routes. So they're trying to get it back, and at one point they attack these hooded figures, or one of the hooded figures, because one of the hooded figures, I think, was trying to choke Mackenzie, Mac. And so someone whacks this hooded figure, And then you get to see his face, and it's weird. It looks monstrous. So you don't know who these people are. Are they monsters? Are they aliens? Are they something weird from some other dimension? We don't know yet. Even by the second issue, we still don't know. But as this guy's running away, Aaron picks up something, and what it looks like is a small computing device with the Apple logo on it. And it's a little bigger than those old iPods. You remember they used to have the really small iPods.
Was that the Nano?
The Nano, yes. And it looks about that size, maybe a little bigger. But the Apple symbol is prominently on one side of it. Now, keep in mind that this is taking place in 1988. And we know it's 1988 because I think they mention the year, but also we see signs for the 1988 presidential race, where Bush and Dukakis ran against each other. And as you mentioned, there are a lot of 80s references. So what is this small computing device from Apple doing there in 1988?
Yeah, it's a very intriguing story, and if you've read Brian K. Vaughan before, it's going to be an interesting story. There's going to be a lot of interesting things going on. But Derek, the thing that I like about this story so much, and it just goes to show you why Brian K. Vaughan is such a good writer. We've got really four. I mean, Erin is the main protagonist, but we've got this group of four girls that are delivering newspapers, and we get a really good feel about all four of these characters. And what he's so good at, what Vaughan is so good at, is establishing character through story. And what I mean by that is we don't have to get bogged down with a lot of backstory or a history lesson. Everything we need to know comes out through the characters, the way they act, the way they think, everything that they're doing. And that's just good storytelling, and that's why he's such a great storyteller.
Exactly. And I want to stick with this topic that you brought up, and that is the way that Vaughan creates and fleshes out character. With the three paper girls that Erin meets when she goes out to deliver, as this issue opens, and that's Mackenzie, Tiffany, and KJ. You're right, we don't get a lot of backstory about them, but the things that they say, the things that they do, for instance, Tiffany and her walkie-talkie, and how they interact with each other, we have a pretty good sense of who these characters are. Now, if we limit our understanding of Erin to just her interaction with those three girls, I don't know if we learn much about Erin compared to Mackenzie, Tiffany, and KJ, but where we learn about Erin, and I think that this is a wonderful way of introducing this character, when this first issue opens, Erin is having a dream, but we don't know that she's having a dream at the time, although we can probably suspect, because she is, curiously enough, holding an apple in her hand. She seems to be on the moon, and she's on her knees, and she is welcomed by Christy McAfee. And so she's in her spacesuit, got the helmet, but she has wings on, and she says, "Welcome to heaven. Everyone from the Challenger is here," because Erin asks, "Hey, you're Christy McAfee. Everyone from the Challenger is here, and so is your Graham, but not your fish, okay?" And so you think that something weird is going on here, but then this dream turns into something a little more hellish, because next we know she's in what looks like a classroom, Erin is, with a demon, and I think this is her sister, Erin's sister, that is with the demon, and the demon is threatening the sister, and it just looks all weird, and then she wakes up. And make sure that Erin does, and make sure that her sister's okay, and then she goes on her paper route. So we don't know exactly what all of that means, the dream, but we can assume that these things will come back in some form later, like her relationship with her sister, what is the emphasis on space travel. But this is a wonderful way for Vaughan to tease out character without revealing too much, telling us just enough about his protagonist, I assume, Erin, but leaving us with a lot of questions nonetheless.
He does, and like you said, he's such a master at all of those things. I mean, he's got these very subtle touches all throughout, and that this takes place during 1988, as you said, but he's addressing so many of these things. But you also know that he's telling us something about what's going on today, and there's so many of those things that he touches on the Challenger disaster. We don't know how much he's going to explore that, if it's going to be a small theme or a big theme. He's got a kid in a Freddy Krueger outfit, which was, enormously popular then. But I think one of the big things that he's trying to tell us is how our society has changed. There's a scene where Aaron, I'm not sure if it's Aaron or Aaron's dad or one of the girls says, their father says, well, newspapers are a dying industry. And that was in 1988, and of course we know what's happened with newspapers now with the internet and everything.
Oh, I think that's what Mackenzie says her father has said.
Yeah, I couldn't remember who had said that, but it's kind of a capsule in time because when's the last time I've seen a newspaper boy or girl? They just don't happen. Derek, you've seen my neighborhood. There's quite a few townhouses, and there aren't paper boys or paper girls anymore. There's one guy in a van that throws maybe 3 papers in our neighborhood, and that's it. So this is kind of a little time capsule of a thing that really may not exist anymore. But there's something about it. There's something about this situation. There's something about the camaraderie between these 4 girls that maybe doesn't exist anymore in that fashion. And I know that Vaughn is trying to say something about that relationship and about these relationships that these girls have with each other. But yet, in the same time, he's got this fantastic mystery that's dying to be solved.
Mm-hmm. And, along with that, Andy, is the kind of fantastical elements that he places in this story. So you have this, the reference, the hearkening back to the 1980s that, many of us as readers, especially older ones, can certainly recognize. And then we have these things that are out of place, such as these mystery hooded figures and what looks like, as we see in the second issue, pterodactyls or something pterodactyl-like, some kind of creatures. In issue number 1, we also see some kind of space capsule. I'm not sure how to describe it because the girls aren't sure. They find because they're searching for their lost or stolen walkie-talkie, and they go into this house, and in the basement they discover something that looks like an American space capsule. And keep in mind, this is the 1980s, so by this point, you have the shuttles that are being used for space travel. This looks something like from the old Apollo missions, but it's weird. It looks like it's made of organic material, and they even comment that it's covered by some kind of material that feels like skin, which is strange. But we don't know what to make of this. They don't know what to make of it. And then on top of that, kind of the cherry on the top of the sundae of the mystery is the Apple computing device. We assume that it's a computing device. And so I think that juxtaposition of the 1980s and these fantastical, futuristic, sci-fi, whatever we want to call them, references are really great. And, he's really setting up this series. I hope that this is something that we'll see for quite a while.
I do too. Yeah, I certainly do too. And Vaughn has a lot of fun with it too. I mean, it's not. There's really, really fun moments. One of the girls, they find that device that you're talking about, that ship or capsule. And she says, well, this is the 50th anniversary of War of the Worlds. It was on radio. And she says, this actor named like Orville Wright tried to trick everyone into believing there was a real alien invasion. So there's a lot of humor in it that, these kids kind of have their history a little messed up. But it's a lot of fun. It's just a good, solid story. And I want to commend Chang for giving us such a good feel for the 80s without overdoing it. I mean, you don't have like tons of people running around with spiked hair and, all the 80s stereotypes that you normally see. You don't have like Madonna imitators and that type of thing. There's enough of the 80s to give us a feel that, yeah, we're in the 80s. But really, other than the clothes and some of the references they make, and other than having newspaper girls, which you don't really see much anymore. I mean, this could be happening anytime.
Yeah, and you were talking about the fashion. I think that we can especially see the 80s in the character of Aaron, the protagonist. But again, Chang does not overdo it. He doesn't fall back on, visual laziness of just using a lot of the visual stereotypes that people have come to know, rightly or wrongly, as defining the 1980s. So, and you and I lived through that. We were, very much hip during that time, unlike now.
I don't think I was very hip. Maybe you were.
Yeah, and this just feels familiar to me without being over the top. So you're right. Chang does do a wonderful job. And another thing that I am glad that Vaughn and Chang didn't fall into either is to turn Paper Girls into a kind of Goonies.
Yes, and that certainly could have easily happened.
Yeah. And who knows? Maybe I'm jinxing this. Maybe it will turn into kind of a Goonies adventure. I don't think so. I've said on this show before, I am not a fan of Goonies, and I am not a fan of Steven Spielberg. But the Goonies the movie is closely associated with the 1980s. So this being about the 1980s, this also being a narrative where you have 4 kids or young people who are, about to go on some kind of adventure where there's a lot of mysteries involved. It starts to smack of Goonieism, and I'm glad that there have not been any Goonie references here. Let's hope our luck holds.
Let's hope so.
One other thing I want to mention before we move on to our next title is the back matter in not only the first but also the second issue. It's always fun the way that Vaughn handles his letters page. And for this first issue, we have something. We have a mascot.
Yeah.
Petey Roy, the paper boy, and he works for the American Newspaper Delivery Guild. And in issue number 1, the letters page begins, "Hey guys, did you know that it's not too late to join the American Newspaper Delivery Guild? All it costs is one self-addressed stamped envelope mailed to the address above. Cool benefits include one membership card with your own unique delivery number, lifetime access to future special events, exclusive opportunities to win awesome prizes. While supplies last, please allow 8 to 12 weeks for delivery." Did you send away for this?
When I was a kid, that type of thing?
No, this now.
Oh, no.
I did.
Did you?
I sent a stamped, self-addressed envelope to the address listed here, and this is in Sherman Oaks, California, to the American Newspaper Delivery Guild. So I hope that supplies, or that I sent it in time, and there are still some supplies there, because I'm wondering what I'll get back.
Well, I wondered if there was going to be anybody that did that.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Of course there would be. Yeah. So I'm looking forward to this.
Well, good. Keep us posted.
So you want to move on to the next title we're looking at?
Yeah, let's take a look at that.
And this is Marjorie Liu and Sana Takita's Monstrous, another Image title. And I know that this is one that you particularly wanted to discuss, but it also captured my attention a couple of months ago. I really was taken by the solicit in previews because Takita's art is just fantastic, which I want to get to. But first, explain to our listeners why you in particular wanted to discuss Monstrous.
Well, Marjorie Liu is a friend of mine. We both went to the Clarion Science Fiction and Fantasy Workshop several years ago, and this was before Marjorie became a famous writer, which she is now. She's a very famous writer of paranormal romance novels. And at the time, we were in this writing workshop, and I got to know her there. And she actually sold her first book, I think, either at the workshop or shortly after. So she really was the star of that class, and she's gone on to like I said, a very, very good publishing career in paranormal romance, and she's also written a lot of books for a lot of comic books. She's done some work for Marvel. I don't know if she's done any for DC, but so comics are a passion of hers as well as writing novels.
Now, see, I'm not familiar with her work in comics or her work in general, but if what we see in Monstrous #1 is any indication of her writing chops, then I want to find out more.
Yeah, she's an excellent writer. Mm-hmm. Yeah, no doubt.
Now, we were just discussing Paper Girls #1, and I think we neglected to mention that was an oversized first issue, which a lot of creators at Image do, almost to the point that we've come to I think we've gotten spoiled, or I feel I've gotten a little spoiled with that, because when a #1 issue doesn't give us extra material, I feel a little cheated, and I shouldn't. I remember that's one of the comments I made about Bitch Planet, that, hey, it'd be nice if this were longer. But I think my arguments there were, I felt it was an incomplete story for that first installment, and maybe a couple of more pages would have aided in fleshing out the premise. But here with Monstrous, not only do we get an extra-sized issue, we get a novel.
Yeah, it's huge in many terms, and it's a 72-page comic, but you really get a lot for your money's worth. I mean, this is an incredible example of excellent world building.
Exactly. So how would you describe the setup that is Monstrous?
Well, Monstrous #1 opens with a 17-year-old girl being sold into slavery to several bidders. And in the opening, she's chained, naked, and she only has one arm, and she has an eye branded on her chest. And the bidders are concerned that the girl is an arcanic, which we don't really know what that means yet, and not a human, because while buying a human would make them savages, buying an arcanic would not. And there's a woman there that's accompanied by this huge, muscular, chained-up man, and they arrive, and they accept the girl and several other children as a quote-unquote donation to their order. So immediately we've got this really unusual buying and selling of people. And again, we're not sure what an arcanic is, if that's a race of people, if that's a tribe of people, we're just not sure. But we have this enormously interesting setup here. And this girl's name, Micah, I would guess it's called
Micah,
Half-Wolf. And we learn about her, we learn about this world, and there's so much I want to talk about with this comic book, but there's so much I don't want to talk about because it's so, again, the world building is so incredible and so intense. And we don't get the whole story at once because Lou is such a really smart storyteller. She gives us what we need to know when we need to know it. We know, for instance, that a war has taken place or is taking place, and the story includes elements of espionage, mythology, the supernatural. And, Derek, with a typical writer, they would just dump all of this into a big, huge mess or a info dump. But Marjorie Liu understands not only how to control all this information, but to make this part of the DNA of this world. It's an incredible story, and I know we want to talk a little bit about the details, but I was just blown away.
Yeah, exactly. And you were talking about there being a lot of story here, and in fact, we were commenting earlier on the length of this first issue. It's almost as if in hearing you attempt to describe, without giving much away, what's going on in this first issue, like you're describing two issues. And really, in going back and rereading Monstrous #1, it's like reading at least two regular comic book issues. There's just so much there. And in fact, you mentioned that our PDF that we're reading from is 72 pages. Apparently, I think there are about 66 pages of story. There are no ads in this first issue. And this is only $4.99. Now, I know a lot of people, myself included, balk at the $4.99 price for a comic book. I mean, $3.99 is not fun. $2.99 is a much sweeter spot. $4.99, But hey, Lou and Takeda give a lot for that. Again, you get 2, maybe even 3 issues worth of story. And as you've mentioned, they really do a great job of condensing a lot. I mean, there's really no decompression that you feel not much went on this first issue.
Yeah, exactly. And there's just so much great stuff to talk about. The art in this comic is just I would call it elegant, but it's also much more than that. It's also, I mean, it's just jaw-dropping. Some of the artwork, and not just the character work, and the character work is wonderful, but the surroundings, the entire world is just so well. It's I'm having a hard time describing it. It's just really beautiful artwork.
It's finely detailed, and given the fantastic setting that we have here, I would even go on to use the word Baroque in terms of Takeda's art and the kind of attention that she brings to fleshing out characters, settings, all of this. So, I mean, the art is a big part of it, and I think it was the art that really drew me to this title when it was solicited a couple of months ago in previews, because even though previews in the image section, they do give, let's say for some titles, 4 pages, 3 pages worth of story. That's something. I don't know if I got a full sense of what Monstrous was, and in fact I was even a little suspicious. I like it well enough, but I'm not the biggest fan of fantasy. And so when I saw this, I thought, I don't know if this will be for me, but it was the art that really pulled me in. But in reading this first issue, I was very much surprised and pleased how wonderful a story it is. And, we were talking earlier about Brian K. Vaughan. I remember when Saga was first solicited, I thought, I'm not big into fantasy, but I like Brian K. Vaughan. I'll try it. And so in both of this is very much like Saga in that there's a lot going on here. This is not just your typical fantasy narrative.
No, it's not. And again, the level of detail in the artwork and in the story too, they work really, really well together. This is a good pairing with Marjorie Liu and Sana Takeda.
Right.
They really, you can just tell that. I mean, I don't know if they got together in person or if they got together through emails, but they get each other.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and we have great character development. You've already mentioned Meika, but we have other figures as well. We see a couple of, they're described as witches. They're members of the Kume. I think that's how you pronounce it. And there's Sophia and Atina, and then there's Sophia's mother, Yvette. And so we get a lot of who these people are. In many ways, like we were discussing in Paper Girls, even with limited page space, we do get a pretty full sense of who these figures are. But there are also other characters. They're in the flashbacks, a friend of Meika's called Tuya. I think that's how you pronounce her name. She's a shorter character who is Meika's companion, and in their discussions during these flashbacks, it's a great way of getting some exposition here. But we also get a larger sense of character through different communities. Now, you've already mentioned Meika being an arcanic figure, someone is, if arcanic is an adjective, is Arcania the place or the people? I'm not sure, but there is one race or group or nation, however we want to describe this, or species, this being a fantastic book, called Arcania or Arcanic, and then there's the Kumea, which seem to be ruled by this witch elite, which Sophia and Atina are a part of, as well as Sophia's mother. And then there's another group of figures of some sort called the Monstra. And even though there's a lot in this first issue, we don't really get to know who Monstra is or are, but it has something to do with what happens to Meika.
Right, and you're right, Derek. This has the makings of what we would call an epic story, and usually in something like that, you've got tons of characters, you've got tons of worlds or countries or kingdoms going on, and we get the sense of that here, but we never get the sense that we're overwhelmed with it, and we're like, oh wait, who are these people? What are they doing? I never got the sense that this was out of control, and that's one of the great things about it is Marjorie Liu has so much control over her story, and she has given us enough to get us going, but not enough to confuse us. And again, just like Brian K. Vaughan, that's just the mark of a great storyteller.
Exactly. So in the kind of character communities that she builds, I mean, for instance, Mecha being an Arcanic, there are other fantastical creatures that are also being sold into slavery along with Mecha at the very beginning. And, some of these look even more fantastical than Mecha do, bordering on the cute, almost manga side. But, it's definitely not a cute story in that sense. So you get a feel of them being the good guys, so to speak. And then with the Kumeya, who are ruled by this witch elite, you get a sense of who they are, not only through Marjorie Liu's story, but also Takeda's art. I don't think there is any bad-looking member of the Kumeya because they're all drawn by Takeda as drop-dead gorgeous. These are, if they are witches, they're witches who are, very, very beautiful. This is not like the Wizard of Oz, Wicked Witch of the East and stuff that you have going on here. And Takeda also draws them quite bosomy, let's say. So, that I think that's part of their allure and part of their power. So without that becoming... it's obvious in the art, their beauty and their voluptuousness, but that doesn't come out in the writing. You just see it, and you sense that that's part of their power as well. Not only the magical, witch element, if we want to call it that, but also their the way that they present themselves and the way that they hover over others.
Yeah. And, Takeda is, I'm assuming that Takeda is the colorist as well. It's not mentioned here, a separate colorist, but if so, the coloring is just fantastic. I mean, the art is, as you said, it's Baroque is a very good way to describe that, but the coloring choices and the color palette is just wonderful as well. There's a really nice, I wonder if this is just a little nod to Brian K. Vaughan. There's a scene, there's a flashback where Makea is talking to this cat, and it's a talking cat, and they're having a conversation. And the cat says, to quote the poets, and then Makea says, I don't like poetry, and the cat goes, liar.
Yeah, I wondered about that.
It reminds you of Lying Cat from Saga. Mm-hmm. If that's it, that's a really nice nod.
I'm sure that it has to be a nod.
Yeah,
because
that was great.
We've already started to make comparisons between Monstrous and Saga being the fantastical stories that they are, and also kind of Saga-like in terms of an epic, right? This is something that has the feel that it's going to go on for a long time, and there is quite a bit of adventure here. So, we were talking about a lot packed into this first issue. This is not just a setup. Mecha gets into, without giving anything away, let's just say a lot of activity that involves some explosions and some violence.
Yeah, and we learned fairly early on that she has certain powers, mm-hmm. And we get a taste of that, and we get some just incredible fight scenes throughout this issue. But we don't know the full extent of her powers yet. And that's one of the things that's really, really great about it is we are exploring this world with her, and we're learning more about her as we go.
Mm. Yeah, this is definitely a title that I'm going to continue with.
Yeah, it's also interesting too. At the very end, we get a few words from Marjorie and from Takeda about, especially Marjorie, because I've known her. For several years, not well, but we're friends. But she talks a little bit about the inspiration for this story and about her grandparents who are Chinese, and kind of what their story meant to her and how some of that has translated into this. So it's really, really nice to see that.
So, Andy, you want to move on to the third #1 issue, also an Image title.
Mm-hmm.
And this is one that I was very much looking forward to. This is The Goddamned. And this brings together again the team of Jason Aaron and R.M. Guerra. They're the guys who brought us Scalped. And, earlier Bob Hodges mentioned the way that he uses Scalped in the classroom. Scalped is, to me, one of the later great Image titles. I mean, the Image had... I think classic Image that really put it on the map. Obviously, there's Sandman, there is, Alan Moore's Swamp Thing, but there are also titles like Preacher and Transmetropolitan, Lucifer, those older titles. But then more recently, we get to Y the Last Man, definitely Fables, right, and even DMZ. Right up there, I would put Scalped.
Yeah, I'm just getting into Scalped. I was really, really late to it. I am actually almost finished with the second trade of Scalped, but it is amazing.
Oh, really? So you're just now getting on board with Scalped?
I'm just now getting on board with it, but it is such a great title. And so I was really glad to see this pairing again with this title. And, it's interesting because we can talk about some of the stylistic similarities and differences here, too.
Okay. So, The Goddamned, probably the best way to describe this is the Bible.
Yeah.
It's okay, let's say Genesis with a lot of profanity.
Yeah.
And a lot of violence. And a lot of liquid. Now, that liquid is blood, it is mud, it is feces. To me, what stands out is, I like the story itself, but, to me, more than Aaron's story is Guerra's art. Yeah. And in this issue. And so... I felt like after reading this first issue a couple of times, I needed to take a shower.
Yeah, you really do.
For a number of reasons.
Well, let's should we just go ahead and tell them what this is about and who this is about, or should we leave that?
No, because this is not a spoiler. It's a big part of what this is, and you found out, into this first issue.
Yeah. Well, I'll just kick it off and just tell listeners what we've got here, and you can tell from the cover, or at least the cover that we have. I don't know if there are alternate covers, that this is going to be, like Derek said, a brutally violent story. We've got skulls stacked up on top of each other, a severed head that's still bleeding, blood dripping off an axe. It's not going to be a nice, clean family book. So if you think it is, this is not for you. So we start off with a scene in the desert wilderness, and we get a quote from Genesis 6:5 and 6, which you can look up. I'm not going to read it right now. Basically, this is taking place 1,600 years after Eden, after the Garden of Eden. And the first thing we see is a one-armed kid peeing off the side of a boulder onto a man lying in this just place of filth where people just go to defecate. And the man is naked, and he doesn't know where he is. And so this boy kind of says, "What are you doing here? I heard you came out of the desert. I heard you came in and you wanted to buy some fire." And, the boy's just going on and on and on. And we finally figure out that this is Cain. This is the story of Cain, the son of Adam and Eve. And if you haven't read your Bible in a while, Cain is the person who killed his brother Abel, which was the first murder recorded in history. And this is his story.
Mm-hmm. I want to go back to something that you mentioned in the setup. You said that we see toward the very beginning this one-armed boy who is peeing into, as they call it, let's say he's peeing into this pit where actually Cain is lying down. I find it interesting that this is a similar or a not dissimilar opening to Jason Aaron and Jason Latour's Southern Bastards, in that we get the first issue opens with a dog defecating.
Right.
So now we have a boy taking a whiz.
Right.
And so maybe there's something about relieving yourself that is a stylistic opening trope for Jason Aaron.
Could be.
Yeah.
Could be. You got to start somewhere.
You got to start somewhere. And I can't remember the very opening page of Scout, but I don't think it's someone peeing or taking a dump. Yeah.
I don't think so.
But you're right. And so does become the story of Cain, and by the well, I was about to say something, but I don't. Maybe that would be a spoiler. I was going to say that we do see another biblical figure at the very end of this.
Yeah, let's save that.
I'll save that, but I will mention that this first issue is titled, or this first narrative arc is titled "Before the Flood." Mm-hmm. So let's just leave it at that.
Yeah, that's enough.
But this is interesting. We do see the character, Cain, who is cursed to walk the earth without dying. And this is, of course, the big grudge he holds against God. And he has, to say the least, several choice words
Yes,
for his Lord.
Yes.
And if you are a comics reader who may take offense at profanity, I don't know if this would be the issue for you. When Andy said a moment ago that this is not family reading, many people sit around with their family and read passages from the Bible. Don't think that this is the same thing.
Right.
Yeah.
And Derek, this brings up a really interesting thing. I'm a Christian. I attend church regularly. And a lot of times when I'm discussing, people ask, what are you watching? What are you reading? I will tell them what I'm watching or what I'm reading, and if it's something that some people they would respond with, well, that really sounds violent or that really sounds profane, and I will respond that there's a lot of violence in the Bible, a lot of it, and one of the things here that I really like about this title is that we see Cain and we see what the devastation that his life has been because of what he did. And you don't get a lot of that described, at least in this story in the Bible, but there's no sense in the Bible that his life was a bed of roses. I mean, his life was probably a living hell from everything that we can take from the Bible. So this may not be that far off the mark as far as Cain's life. And a lot of times when we read the Bible, we kind of gloss over those really, really atrocious parts and think, oh, it was just, that culture, or it was just ancient times. There was a lot of horrific stuff in the Bible. And this, we don't know how accurate this is. I mean, this is a story, but there's probably a lot to it.
Yeah. Now, you were mentioning story. One of the things, I said earlier that what I'm drawn to more in this first issue is Guerra's art than Aaron's story. Now, Aaron's story is good, especially when it comes to the introduction at the end that we alluded to but didn't go into detail about. Really, when it comes down to this series setup, there's not much to this first issue. Basically, we find out that Cain has come into this desert community, and apparently he was beaten and had his things taken by a group called the Bone Boys. And we get this information when the little kid is taking a piss and he's talking with Cain, and he's wondering, how are you still alive? And so he's wondering what's going on, and Cain vows to go back and get his stuff. Basically, that's it. And so he goes back to this community, and it's the Bone Boys village is, I mentioned earlier, there's a lot of liquid and goo in this first issue. You'll definitely see it in this village. It's very violent, very bloody, very muddy, very messy, dirty, all of the above. And so he gets his stuff, and then that's basically it until we get to that very end with the interesting twist of the other biblical figure. And so there's not much to this first issue, but I don't feel that this was short-shrifted in terms of story or decompressed to the point that I'm aggravated. And that's primarily because of Guerra's art. The action scenes, the way that the characters are drawn, the very setting. Again, I come back to the gooiness of this first issue is really represented well by Guerra's art. So to me, that's what really makes this first issue. And it also reminds me of one of the reasons why I absolutely loved the Scalped series. And so it's good to see Guerra back, and it's good to see Guerra and Aaron working together again.
It is good to see them working together. And, I kind of like to call this, it's almost like Conan on steroids. I mean, this Kane is just going absolutely wild with beating up these Bone Boys. It's brutally violent, but it's really rendered well. And like you, I like Guerra's art, which, at least as far as I've read in Scalped, was mostly dark or took place in dark settings. But here, everything takes place outdoors in the daylight, so it's quite a different look from what I'm used to in Scalped. And it kind of, Derek, reminds me somewhat of Richard Corbin's art in some ways. Maybe not quite stylistically, but maybe in the way that he handles action. And Corbin's violence is a little bit different than Guerra's, but it had a little bit of that
kind of an excessiveness.
Yeah, excessiveness. But I agree with you that the really interesting part of this comic takes place after all the carnage, and I'm really interested to see where things are going to go after this.
Yeah, because after that, the aforementioned carnage, which is where Kane goes back to the Bone Boys and beats the crap out of them to get his stuff back. After that, basically, almost the rest of the issue, is a series of voiceovers, or what would be thought bubbles in older comics, but we get, Kane basically filling us in becomes exposition, really, and we get the background of who he is and what has gone on. So it's interior monologue is what it is.
Yeah, and I kind of like the way that if you haven't read the version in the Bible, you can read it in Genesis 4. But in the Bible, the original version, it's not that nobody can kill Cain, but God placed a mark on Cain so that people would see it and would not mess with him. It's sort of the same type of thing, but it's really interesting, and I'm interested to see where he's going to go with this.
Yeah, this is a very different Kane than the Kane we got in House of Mystery.
Oh, yeah. Yes.
So the next title that Andy and I are looking at for this week is from Boom Studios, and this is another one that I was very much looking forward to because you have a star creator, just as we did with Brian K. Vaughan and Jason Aaron, and that is Klaus. Written by Grant Morrison with art by Dan Mora. Now, there are some comics that have come out lately that the writer and the genre didn't necessarily seem to mesh. So, for instance, what was the Garth Ennis book that just recently started that was billed as a romance on a train? I can't remember the title.
Oh, you guys talked about it.
Well, we mentioned it on a preview show, but we didn't review it. And of course, that I haven't read that yet, but just the whole idea of Garth Ennis and a romance going together sounds strange. Well, this book, Klaus, is Grant Morrison and the story of Santa Claus, just in time for the holiday season.
That's right.
So this is a different kind of Santa Claus. This is not your granddad's Santa Claus.
That's for sure.
Yeah, and so basically what we have in this first issue, and this is one of the first of 6 issues, so this is going to be a mini-series. At the very beginning of this issue, we have this man who turns out to be Claus, and he is a very muscular, figure, and I love Mora's art. I think that's one of the things that really stands out in this issue. I mean, I'm not sure if you're as big of a fan of this, and we can talk about this, but I really like where this first issue goes. So I like Morrison's writing. I see this as definitely Grant Morrison kind of writing, but it's Mora's art that really does solidify this. So at the beginning, we see a man walking from the background into the foreground. He has a sled behind him, and he's coming into this village. And he notices that, and what is the village called? I can't.
Oh, it's called...
I'm blanking on that.
Grimsvig.
Grimsvig, yes. And so he comes to sell his wares because he has done this for years. He has a pretty good relationship with the people at Grimsvig, but he hasn't been there in a while, and things are a little different. And Klaus is noticing that things have changed, that the people aren't as friendly. He goes into a tavern that he frequents whenever he's there, and there's another barkeep. And he asks what happened to the previous barkeep, and the one who's there, he draws his finger across his neck and says, he talked when he shouldn't have. So he said the wrong thing too many times. Best say nothing. And that basically is what Grimsvig has become. People cower, they watch their place because it is under new leadership. And the person who oversees Grimsvig is Lord Magnus. And so we get to see him later on, as well as his wife, Lady Dagmar, and his son. We can talk about him, Jonas. But basically in this first issue, you get Klaus, who comes to Grimsvig and realizes that things have changed. He tries to stand up for a little boy that is being knocked about by the guards of Grimsvig, and then Klaus is beaten and thrown out of the city and threatened with death. And right before he's about to be killed, Klaus whistles, and out comes a wolf that we find out later is named Lily. And so Lily is his, I guess, trusted companion. And so the last part of this first issue is Klaus trying to doctor his wounds because he has been pierced with an arrow or a spear. And he's sitting around the fire with Lily, and something strange occurs. Klaus is playing what looks like a flute, and these lights... I mean, to me, this is part of the typical Grant Morrison part of this first issue. There are these kind of spirits that look like spirits, but at the same time, they look like skeletons. They do something that looks very psychedelic to Klaus, and when Klaus wakes up, he notices that his hands are aching, and he's not sure why. And he looks at the ground, and what does he find? Tons of toys. And that's how this first issue begins. And so here we have the association of this big burly guy who got the crap beaten out of him by the Grimsvig guards, who now turns into Santa Claus because he's making toys. But how he came to make the toys, we still don't know what to make of those weird spirit skeleton figures. So I think that's the basic setup. There's not a lot that goes on to this first issue, and it's a regular-sized first issue, but it's a good story. I think this is a good, solid #1 issue. It definitely has me in. Even if this weren't Grant Morrison, I think I would be on board. Now, you and I were talking before we started to record. You're not going to be as kind to this first issue as I am. Is that true?
I'm going to have to play Siskel and Ebert on this one because I really did not think this was a very good comic. I thought, Derek, that this was pretty heavy-handed, pretty forced, and I was really, really surprised but I will say, as you said, it does take a very interesting turn toward the end, and that part is where I thought this really becomes a Grant Morrison comic toward the very end. I thought this was very atypical Grant Morrison. It's very standard, very linear, very straightforward, almost ordinary, except for the ending. Now, the things that I didn't like about it, I just thought there were a lot of stereotypes, not very good dialogue, and not very much development of Klaus. You've got this scene where he comes into town. Everybody's working in the coal mines, and he says, "Oh, this used to be a happy town." And there's a sign that says, "It is forbidden to wish." And he says, there was a time when Grimsvig was bright with light and song. I'm like, wow, this is just really not what I was expecting. We get this whole, playing during the holidays is good, working is bad theme. And the kid, Master Jonas, he's just an over the top spoiled brat. I was really disappointed in this.
Okay, so were you disappointed in this first issue as a whole, or are you disappointed in the fact that this is a Grant Morrison first issue?
Well, I think I'm really disappointed in the way that the story was told. Again, I did not see anything very, very exciting or very compelling about it. And, actually, when I read through it, I had to go back and see that, Grant Morrison really wrote this. I just don't think this is I don't think this is one of his best efforts. Well,
you mentioned that this is more or less a straightforward, linear first issue in terms of story. I think in expecting, and maybe this is what you were expecting Grant Morrison to do the kind of metafictional, kind of strange twists every time. That's not what he's always about. Now, I think that does go a long way to describing his style, his writing style, and that's the kind of Grant Morrison that I absolutely love. But we do get a more traditional storytelling Grant Morrison, and usually it's in the superhero narratives. I'm thinking of JLA, his run on JLA. Even in most, I think, of his Batman stuff, we get, pretty good, straightforward, nothing too weird and fantastical storytelling. And that's fine. This is, I think, of the latter. This is definitely not Doom Patrol or The Invisibles.
Oh, no.
Or even Happy. So, I mean, there is that more traditional storytelling side of Grant Morrison that we see revealed here. And along with that, now I know that it would take someone like a Morrison to take a figure that is so ingrained in our psyche, Santa Claus, and to turn him on its head. This is not where he wants to go. So if he doesn't want to really do anything dramatically different with Santa Claus, then much of his script is already written for him. So what you feel as heavy-handedness, and to a degree, I do see what you're saying. Jonas being the spoiled brat, the stark difference between it's almost like an Ebenezer Scrooge thing we have going on in this city, right? Working on holidays when, Yuletide, when people are supposed to be celebrating. He does play into that. But again, I think that if he made the decision, if Grant Morrison makes the decision, okay, I'm going to handle Santa Claus in a way that honors the tradition, his hands are tied, his storytelling hands are tied to a point. But I think that there are those elements of this story, especially toward the end, where he does give it that Morrison-esque twist. Now, there are two places that I see Grant Morrison definitely putting his stamp on this first issue, and one is minor. This is at the very beginning. This is the opening when, as described earlier, a figure walking from the distance, coming into the foreground, and he's pulling a sled with him. In the setup, the words that accompany these images is, "Once upon a time and a place, there was a man. These days everyone knows his name, but few could tell you who he really is or how he started." This is the greatest untold story of them all. And to me, I mean, that just says Grant Morrison, that he does these kind of things, that he is about to tell us that he's going to tell the story of Santa Claus in ways that are not that different from the way he first began telling us stories of Batman. Because even though, yeah, it's kind of a traditional way of his Batman stories, of his storytelling, it's a different kind of Batman. And Grant Morrison, in maybe more subtle than dramatic ways, has given us a different take on Batman from his time on it. So I think that's the first part of this #1 issue that says Grant Morrison. And then the second part is what I mentioned earlier. Toward the end, when Claus is playing his flute or his recorder, and these spirits appear, and we don't know what to make of them, but something weird goes on, and the way that Dan Mora draws this, and who did the colors? I'm
Did he do the colors as well?
I don't know. I'm
there's
trying to find.
I'm not sure there's a.
No, the colors are by Dan Morris. So both the illustrations and Morris colors, I think, are just fantastic, and it is psychedelic. There is some. It's almost as if Santa is on mushrooms, and that this is what causes him to make all the toys and to blank out from having created all of these toys. And so that was definitely the Grant Morrison touch to the Santa Claus story at the very end. But you didn't see it. Well, let me respond to a couple of those things. I'm not trying to limit Grant Morrison and what he can do. I mean, he can do anything he wants to and has done many, many things. And you're right that Christmas stories often carry some of that baggage that you mentioned. But, I'm just not compelled except until the ending, which is interesting. It's not so much the story, but it's the way that the story is told. And again, I just thought it was forced, heavy-handed, and I just thought Morrison's a better storyteller than this. Okay. And again, I can see where you're coming from in the relationship, Lord Magnus, Jonas, and Lady Dagmar. Although there is something interesting with Lady Dagmar. She seems to be the one in this triumvirate ruling over the town that is someone that will probably come to like. Mm-hmm. I mean, I don't know. And there was a part of me after reading this or rereading this first issue, and I was looking at the way that Lady Dagmar was treated by her husband and then Jonas, and I'm thinking, okay, she's going to become a sympathetic character. Hey, I wonder if she'll become Miss Santa Claus.
I wonder.
I don't know. I have no way of knowing. But, yeah, the heavy-handedness there is definitely in the middle part of this story, with the way that the town is described, and especially with this brat, Jonas. God.
Yeah, I mean there are some, like you said, the opportunities with the mom. There are some opportunities to have some really interesting character things going on. We don't get very much at all about Sergeant Lindquist. He could be a very interesting character. We just don't get much of him here. But feel free to send the Morrison hate mail to me. But I just didn't think it was very good, and I wanted it to be good. And I would read the next issue hoping that most of the problems that I'm having with the issue are let's get the world built here and let's introduce readers to this world. Maybe it will go forward from here. Again, I think the end of the comic is very interesting, and that does make me want to read some more. I'm hoping we'll get to know more about Klaus too, because we really don't know that much about him, and since this is his title, I assume we're going to get a lot more development about him.
Yeah. Well, we have 5 more issues.
That's right.
Well, the 5th #1 issue that we're looking at for this week is Snowblind. This is written by Ollie Masters with art by Tyler Jenkins, and this is coming from Boom Studio. And, this is another one I remember being solicited a couple of months ago, and Andy Konka and I wondering about this title. Just the very premise seemed to be of interest because it deals with the Witness Protection Program. So that in itself is intriguing.
Yeah, I was intrigued by this too. It kind of reminded me of that movie Running on Empty with River Phoenix and his parents having kind of a shady past. Some similarities with this, but this is a completely different story. This starts with a young man named Teddy Ruffins, who is caught by the police for, of all things, breaking into the library.
Yeah. And by the way, the name Teddy Ruffin just, I don't know, it sounds like a teddy bear, like Teddy.
Yeah.
What was it? Teddy Ruskin? What,
yeah.
Was there a teddy bear called that?
There was something like that. Yeah, it's close to that.
Oh, I'm sorry. I interrupted you. Go ahead.
No, that's okay. So, I mean, in my line of work, we don't, look too favorably on breaking into the library. And he doesn't want anything. He just wants to read. And his mom and dad. His dad's name is Billy and his mom's name is Jen. So Billy and Jen are there as the cops bring Teddy home. And they have a conversation. They're not very happy with him, as you could understand. But the mom, Jen, says, "You just have to face it, Billy. Teddy just isn't like you. And maybe that's a good thing." And we find out that when Teddy was very, very young, his family moved from Louisiana all the way to Alaska, which is quite a move. And we get a few clues into Teddy, into who he is, what he's reading, and in the beginning sounds like it might be like a hard-boiled detective novel. He's got these posters on the wall of movies like Chinatown and The Third Man. And he's somewhat an antisocial kid at school, but he's something of a detective here. And he first wants to discover who broke into their house recently.
And also, I'm sorry, and I even see a poster, I think it's a Touch of Evil.
Oh, it's Touch of Evil in there too. Okay.
Yeah, we don't have page numbers, but I had overlooked those noir references, and so when you mentioned that, I looked at the opening pages, and yeah, there looks to be something of Orson Welles. Again, the second Orson Welles reference on this episode, and it seems to be a Touch of Evil. So there you go.
There you go.
I'm sorry, I keep interrupting you.
No,
I am
I
a
just,
rude mofo.
I just thought this was a really, a nicely effective story. The reader should know the story is only 23 pages long, so there's not an awful lot of story. And this is going to be this is the first of 4 issues, so it's not going to be a very long-running, or it doesn't appear to be a very long-running story. But I enjoyed it. I thought it was an interesting premise. And, of course, I always like the artwork of Tyler Jenkins, who's done Peter Panzerfaust. I think he does great work there. And then Ollie Masters, who we looked at quite a while back, the first issue of The Kitchen.
Right.
So I think this is a really good pairing.
Yeah. Now, did you go on to read the rest of The Kitchen?
No, actually, I would like to, but the first issue is the only one I've read.
Huh. And I was curious because I read everything up to the last issue, and I just never got around to reading that. You know, we said earlier in the show that both of us have kind of tapered off with single issues, and that's part of the reason why I haven't yet finished The Kitchen. But I loved what he was doing there. Panzerfaust is interesting in that you made the reference to that in light of Jenkins. I have not yet read that, but when you and I and Kunka were at Heroes Con back in June, there was one retailer that is really good. They had a lot of new trades for $5 each, and so I got the first 3 volumes of Peter Panzerfaust, hoping to read them soon, but again, I haven't gotten around to it yet. So
yeah, it's a great title. Now, I would say the artwork on this is very different from what he does with Peter Panzerfaust. There's it's almost a really nice. There's a lot of nice watercolor work going on here by Jenkins, and which he doesn't really do in Peter Panzerfaust, if I'm remembering correctly.
Yeah. This does strike me as a very different style. So. If you're a fan of Panzerfaust and you're coming to this expecting similar art, you got the same artist, but just a different approach, which I like, in fact.
I do too, yeah.
This is a good issue. Now, you mentioned that this, I guess you can call it a regular-sized issue. Did you get around to reading issue number 2?
No, I haven't read number 2 yet.
Okay, and the reason I am asking you this, Andy, is you and I got copies of issue number 2 of Snowblind, which comes out in December. But when I had requested a review copy, a PDF of Snowblind, the guys at Boom sent that and the second one. And for the second one, it's just the interior, so we don't even have cover or copyright information. So I do know a little bit about what happens with the story after issue 1 ends, so I will restrict my comments to going no further than where number 1 ends.
Okay, good.
Yeah, but yeah, it is a fascinating story, and it sets up a really good mystery. This is something you mentioned earlier. This is a one of 4, and by the way, this one and the one we just discussed, Claws, are limited. And one of the things that Boom does as, I guess, a matter of policy, it seems, is when they have a miniseries, they will let you know this is one of 4 or one of 6. And that's not what we can always say with Image. And, maybe Image, with some of these titles, they plan on making them ongoing, or they're just testing the waters to see if it could be ongoing. And once they find that it may not be for whatever reason, maybe it's because of sales, or maybe it's because of the creators themselves, they decide to turn it into a miniseries. And so when you get in on a title and you're hoping and expecting it to be an ongoing, maybe a great example of that recently, coming back to Brian K. Vaughan, is We Stand on Guard. I expected that to be an ongoing, but then we learned about a month or two ago that was ending. So Image tends to do that. They're not the only publisher that is not clear at the outset whether it is an ongoing or a limited. Boom does, though, let you know this. And so we know that with Claws we're getting a limited. We know with Snowblind we're getting a limited. And I mention all of this by way of suggesting that after reading the first issue, and even the second, but I won't say anything about that, I get a sense that this could be longer than 4. It would make sense to me because there's a lot of potential in this premise.
I think there's a lot of potential as well, and I was somewhat disappointed when I saw that it was going to be one of 4 because I think this could be carried out. But it's interesting what you bring up as far as Image and the way they handle this and the way that Boom handles this. Not quite the same way. Very very different in some aspects. If your story is 4 issues long, it's 4 issues long, and I appreciate that. I like knowing that. Hey, here's the story that we have to tell. It's going to be 4 issues long. And after that, that's all there is. Mm-hmm. Maybe there will be an offshoot to it, or maybe there's going to be a different type of story that's related to it, and that's fine. But, I'm okay with that, and I appreciate Boom doing that.
Yeah, I don't see this as being a series of miniseries because it does seem a containable story. Mm-hmm. I just wonder if maybe they could extend it beyond the 4. It has that potential. So in this first issue, you were setting things up. We have Teddy who finds out that his family is not what he thought it was. In other words, he does learn that they are in the witness protection program. And so then, and the way that he finds this out is, that photograph that he takes of his father who had a little too much to drink at a neighborhood cookout, puts that on, I don't know, Facebook or Twitter, someplace on social networking site, and his friends retweet it or repost it, and it gets out there. And then is when the federal marshal comes by and says, well, we need to do something about this. You're being exposed, and Teddy overhears them. So he follows this is toward the end of the issue, he follows his father one day to find out what this mystery might be. And he learns that, he has an uncle who apparently is the twin of his father, and he wonders if this is the individual who had broken into their house soon after, or not long after, that social media exposure. So, there's a lot of mystery here, and I can tell you without giving anything away that there are additional levels of mystery that are added in the second issue that complicates this storyline even more. So that's one of the reasons why I say that this does seem like it could be a longer miniseries. So I hope that by the time we get to issues 3 and 4, that Masters and Jenkins don't quickly end it or fishtail this, because this has a lot of potential.
Well, yeah, I agree too. There was enough intrigue and enough mystery in that first issue, it would seem, to go beyond 4 issues. But they Masters and Jenkins, I'm sure they have everything well under control. I really like this. The only question I had was possibly believing that Teddy had never suspected anything was going on with his parents before now. That was the only thing about it that really kind of didn't quite work.
That's a good point, because, as you illustrate at the very beginning, we do find out something about Teddy's character when we see him being brought home by the police because he broke into, of all places, a library. And I know you as a librarian don't like people breaking in, but in my book, so to speak, no pun intended, if you're going to break into anything, hey, break into the library and read a book.
Right.
It's better than, picking up jewelry or stealing other things. But so yeah, he's a reader, but more importantly, he is a loner. He's someone who kind of stands apart from his family. So you're right, given his character, given the fact that he is an outsider, wouldn't you think that he would feel something is askew before we see him as the story begins?
Yeah. So, I mean, that's just a little bit of a hurdle to get over, but it's not a huge one.
Right.
And yeah, Teddy is a very interesting character. Like you said, he's somewhat of an outcast at school, and he does the little thing with the social media and the picture of his dad kind of to fit in. And in a way it works, and in a way it doesn't. But yeah, he's an interesting character, and you can tell that he's a sharp kid too. I mean, his parents are intelligent, he's intelligent, and that was just a little bit of a wondering why it took him so long to figure out something was going on. But still, I enjoyed this quite a bit.
Me too. And one of the things I'm curious to see develop, and I hope it does develop, is what Masters and Jenkins do with the Fox references. And I wondered about that because, if you look at the cover, you do have in the foreground Teddy, but you also have a close-up of a fox. It looks like he's yawning, really, the way his mouth is open and the tongue is curled, but it could be that he's about to eat, for all we know. And in fact, there is a silhouetted image of someone with a gun. It looks like the way that things are composed on this cover, like this silhouetted figure is running into the fox's mouth. And I think that's really clever. Obviously you don't have a little man running into the mouth of a fox. It's just the way that these images are juxtaposed that gives you that feel. And it seems that from the very beginning, Teddy is associated directly with this fox because when he's being brought home by the police from breaking into the library, he's waiting outside, and there's a fox that comes up and observes him and then runs off. And we see reference to the fox again at the end when we have an interesting turn. And I don't think this is a spoiler to mention that he has an accident, Teddy does, in the vehicle that he's driving. So that's how this first issue ends. But as he's driving, one of the things that apparently, from what I can gather, causes him to crash is a fox runs out into the road or runs in front of him. So there's got to be this association between Teddy and the fox. I mean, when you think about it, a fox is a solitary creature. He does his own thing, very much like Teddy. So I'm curious to see how the fox links and the fox references play out.
Yeah, I'm interested in that too, as well. Any metaphorical things that could be going on, as well as the title. The title can have multiple meanings.
Mm-hmm. So I like this.
Me too.
Now, the final #1 issue that Andy and I are looking at this week is a character that is another one of these classics, right? So we discussed the way that Jason Aaron and R.M. Guerra were handling Cain and other biblical figures. We discussed the ways that Morrison and Mora were handling Santa Claus. Now we get someone maybe not on par with Cain and Santa, but a big name nonetheless. Bond, James Bond.
That's right.
So, issue #1 of Bond coming out from Dynamite, written by the great Warren Ellis and illustrated by Jason Masters. And, another thing that's notable, Andy, about the selections that we've made for this week is that, we're dealing with some, major characters like Santa, like Cain and Bond, but also look at the creators that we're focusing on. I mean, Brian K. Vaughan, Jason Aaron, Grant Morrison, Warren Ellis. There's one other title that I want to mention later that is another great writer. So it's almost as if we had an embarrassment of riches, of potential.
We do. Like you said, we've got some really heavy hitter creators here. But it's interesting that, I'll save that for just a moment. But yeah, this is a And Derek, you had to wonder about, okay, a James Bond title is coming out at pretty much the same time that the new James Bond movie is coming out,
Right.
which I have not seen. But this doesn't really seem like it's a money grab on the part of Dynamite. It's just I think this is a pretty good, in the hugely unlikely event that you've never experienced anything related to James Bond, which is astronomical. This first issue does a pretty good job of introducing the character without giving the reader a lot of unnecessary baggage.
Exactly. Now, of course, I've experienced James Bond narratives before, but I have to admit, I am not a James Bond aficionado by any stretch of the imagination. I've seen a couple of films. Mm-hmm. I've never read any of the books, and I'm not one of those who has kept up with the various James Bond over the years. I mean, when I was growing up, it was Roger Moore who was the James Bond, and before that it was Sean Connery. So those are the two James Bonds that I really know. Now, I've seen other James Bonds here or there, or at least section of those movies, but I really am not enmeshed in, the James Bond universe. I couldn't really tell you the pros and cons of the various actors who have played Bond, outside of the fact that Timothy Dalton was only in one film, and there's maybe a reason for that, which is unfortunate because I like Dalton.
Yeah, I do too.
But I feel that even though I know about Bond, I'm coming to this as somewhat of a novice. And I know that this is another one that Kunka and I had highlighted in a previous episode, and he's much more into Bond than I am. And one of the things that Andy pointed out was that this is not the kind of sanitized version of Bond that we get from Hollywood. This is going to be more in line with the original Ian Fleming Bond. Do you know this to be the case?
I think it is the case because like you said, I'm not a huge fan, but I may be somewhere in between where you and Kunka are. I've probably seen most of the movies, not all the movies. And actually last year, for the first time, I read a Bond novel. I read Casino Royale, which I was very surprised is, as you said, is it makes the movies look sanitized. I mean, this was a really, really hard-hitting story. And if you've seen the newer Casino Royale, not the David Niven one, which was very different, but if you've seen the Daniel Craig one, the first Daniel Craig Bond movie, Casino Royale, it does get a little bit more heavy hitting than you might think of, especially in one scene of your typical Bond pictures. But yeah, the books, it would appear to me, are a little bit more gritty, a little bit more in your face. But this book, even though I am fairly familiar with the James Bond universe, even though it was pretty much familiar territory, it was still enjoyable. And when you've got a property like James Bond, or something that's been around for a very long time, you try to put all of your baggage behind you and just enjoy the story as a story. And actually, I was able to do that with this.
I agree. And by the way, I do have to say that I'm a fan of the David Niven version of Casino Royale for this reason. Little Jimmy Bond.
Ah, yes.
Kunka accuses me of having to make a Woody Allen reference in almost every episode. So this is my obligatory Woody Allen reference for this show, is that it's not the greatest movie in the world, but the small role that Woody Allen has in that version of Casino Royale is hilarious.
Yeah, I mean, it's if you're in the mood for that type of James Bond, it's fun. It's fun.
It's a great send up. But you're right. This is a good first issue. It definitely gets us into the storyline. And you're right. This is a different kind of Bond. The first, and we're looking at a PDF review copy, the first 12 pages is, and that's about half of this issue, is the setup. And it's interesting in that we don't really get the intro title to this narrative arc, which is Vargr, V-A-R-G-R, until, I think we have that on the copyright page, but we get this in big letters on that 12th page of this PDF that we're reading from. And the 12 pages that include the first half is a different kind of Bond because there is a lot of violence, and this is the kind of James Bond that we don't see in the movies. In essence, what we have is, in these first 12 pages, Bond on a revenge mission.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
And you usually don't think of Bond as the kind of character who would get revenge. I mean, and really graphic revenge. I mean, he's chasing this guy. He not only throws cinder blocks at him, seems to be almost breaking his back. He is chopping his fingers off with a shovel. And we find out right before he kills the man that the reason why he's after him is because this fugitive killed 008. Who was a close friend of 007.
Yeah, and from the movies, if you remember them, there's, usually when the villain gets his comeuppance, there's some kind of snarky line that Bond delivers at the end. And you don't get that here. It's not there's none of this, there's no tongue-in-cheek stuff going on here. It's out and out revenge here at the very beginning. And it's a pretty intense chase, gunfight, fight scene. And it's very, very effective.
Yeah, exactly. And that makes this James Bond much more of an anti-hero than the kind of James Bond that we get in the films. I wouldn't argue that James Bond here, represented by Warren Ellis, is an anti-hero in the traditional sense. But there is a darker side to him that kind of complicates the way that we take him in. Not the most attractive of characters. See, even in the films, you get... there may be things that James Bond does that you wouldn't necessarily agree with, but there's a bit of a charm here. And even though there is some charm to Ellis's Bond, there is more of a dark side. Now, you mentioned the cute sayings every now and again when, in the movies, James Bond talks to the villain, the person that he's about to shoot. And on page 11 of this first issue, when the guy that he's about to kill asks him who he is, who James Bond is, Warren Ellis could have fallen back on the character, the old trope, right? Mm-hmm. Bond, James Bond. But no, he says, I'm 007. And that's it. And I liked the way that Ellis avoided those kind of cute one-liners.
Mm-hmm. The closest we get to that is when Bond later on is meeting Q, the guy that designs all the gadgets and things for him. And he's giving Bond a hard time about the gun that he carries. He calls it a girl's gun. And then the floppy leather gun holster that he uses. And Bond says, a hard holster would spoil the line of my suit.
Yeah.
So that's really the only bit of that, wink, wink, nod, nod that we get in this.
Exactly. And, I agree with you that that's the closest we come to any kind of cute line. But I didn't even read it in that way because it's very much in character. I mean, this is a guy, we were talking about his less than admirable qualities, what would make him, an ideal hero. And, of course, we would not want a James Bond to be an ideal hero. But, he's someone who does not hesitate from intense violence when it comes to the people that he's after. But also he is quite self-centered. And we see this in a few scenes, one of which is what you just referenced when he says, a hard holster would spoil the line of my suit. But also the way that he interacts with other people in the agency. Mm-hmm. So, I mean, we can see that, this guy is very self-assured, rather smug. And we've come to expect that to some degree.
Yeah, we have, and also missing are the martinis, the Bond girls, and unless you count Moneypenny. So a lot of the things that we typically think of as Bond tropes are either not there or they're not there in the way that we're used to seeing them.
Yeah, and even Moneypenny is, she's a woman, she's sitting out front, and she's cleaning a gun. There's nothing alluring, sexy, or at least overtly so about this character, the way that Masters draws her. And I appreciated that.
Yeah, and I haven't seen, like I said, the last, actually the most recent film, Spectre, I haven't seen, but I've seen all the other Daniel Craig films. And it seems that Ellis is picking up a little bit on some of those themes that, Bond is in a new and changing world. Things have changed. The Cold War is over. but there's a lot of things that are definitely going on. But there's also this sense that Bond isn't just taking any crap anymore from anybody. He's got, you know, bigger things in mind than just doing the next operation.
Exactly. And, you know, we haven't talked much about the actual content outside of that opening scene where he gives that one guy his comeuppance, the guy who killed 008. You know, this first issue is basically divided into, well, 3, arguably 4 sections. There's that first section, the first 12 pages that I mentioned, which is about half of that issue. Then there is I think it's a 2-page cutaway to a part of, and I guess this is London, where there's some drugs going on, and we see someone who's playing a guitar, who I guess will be important in the story later. We don't know. This is the only appearance he makes in this, but this 2-page interlude basically sets up the mission that Bond is going to be covering, and that is, you know, looking into some group, some gang, some dealer that has some really hardcore drugs, and so that's what he's going to be going after in this story. And then so that takes place in the 3rd section of the book, and you know, this is at headquarters, where, you know, we see Moneypenny, we see Q, and he gets his mission right. Now, another complication in the content of the story is what is that? The new law, or not the new law, but the one that you're starting to enforce, that agents, MI5 agents, cannot have weapons on them within Great Britain.
Right. And, you know, I don't have the PDF in front of me, but there's, you know, the 00 agents were exempt from that.
Right.
But now that has changed.
Yes, exactly. And in fact, I'm looking at the pages now. It's called the Hard Rule, and the extension of the Hard Rule is that, MI6 officers can't have arms in the UK. So, you know, you mentioned his gun, and he hands that over. I calls it a girly gun, but, you know, he's attached to it. But he feels naked without his gun, and he, in the scene that follows, kind of bemoans the fact, I shouldn't have to do this. But once he leaves the country, he will be provided with a gun. And then it takes us to the last page. Yeah, the last page, which is arguably that 4th section, if we want to divide it into 4 bits. And there's something going on here. We don't have much information, but again, it's a great setup for what's to follow, that apparently someone who probably has something to do with the drug issues that were referenced earlier is also working on something else, because we see this very muscular man who looks like he's being prodded in kind of a scientific laboratory type manner, and he is immune to, what is it, pain and pleasure? He suffers chronic anhedonia.
Yeah.
And by the way, my second Woody Allen reference for today, you know what the original title for Annie Hall was?
No.
Anhedonia. An inability to experience pleasure.
Really? That was it?
Yeah, that was a working title for a while. So anyway, back to James Bond. And so we have someone who, this guy who is suffering extreme anhedonia is being asked to kill James Bond. And so this is what we get coming out of that very first issue.
I like where this is going. I admit I was skeptical when I saw it, because again, the movie's just out, and I thought, oh, okay, here we go. But you know, it's a nice mixture of the traditional Bond and contemporary things that are going on in a world that's changing, and Bond is forced to change with it. So I enjoyed it.
Yeah, I did too. Now, Andy, I mentioned earlier that you and I had an embarrassment of riches to choose from when it came to number ones. And so one of the things that you and I have been doing over the past couple of weeks is deciding what exactly we would be looking at. And I think even 6 issues for just one episode is kind of a lot, but we did it. And if we count issue number 2 of Paper Girls, really that's 7 issues that we've discussed. But there were other contenders in the field, and we looked at those as well, such as issue number 1 of Citizen Jack, Mystery Girl, Joe Gollum, Johnny Red, Limbo, Last Sons of America, and then Black Magic. And it was kind of tough to decide what not to include. Now, did you get the opportunity to read any of those other number 1 issues?
I haven't yet, but I do want to get to those.
Well, one that I read, not all of those, but I read, I think, most of them. One that I found particularly painful to leave off of this list was Black Magic number 1. And the reason is I'm a big fan of Greg Rucka. We've discussed many of his comics on previous episodes of the Comics Alternative. And this is another one of his great titles. This is written by Greg Rucka with art by Nicola Scott. Scott's art is absolutely phenomenal. And as Rucka tends to do, he handles female protagonists very well here. The premise of this is Black Magic. Magic is spelled M-A-G-I-C-K. This is the story of a police officer by the name of her last name is Black. What is her first? Starts with an R. I'm blanking here on her first name, but it does start with an R. And as this issue opens, we see that there's some kind of coven. There's some ceremony taking place out in the forest, and it has everything to do with witches and black magic. And in the middle of this ceremony, someone's cell phone goes off, and it happens to be our protagonist, Officer Black. So she says that someone better have died for this to be an interruption. And in fact, what she finds is she's called away to a hostage situation. And what we have is someone who has gone into a diner, place, a burger joint, and has taken several hostages. And the reason why he's taken them is he specifically wants to talk to Black. And in fact, her first name is Rowena, I think it is, but she's called Ro, so Ro Black. And he asks for her, and things are very suspicious. They're wondering why this is the case. So once he gets Ro Black into the diner, he lets the other hostages go, and we get to see why it is her in particular that he wanted to speak with, why he did what he did in order to get her into the diner with him. And I won't give anything else away, because what we find out in the final pages really sets up what I'm sure will unfold in the next issue or two to come. So this is a great series. It's one that I wish we had had time to discuss in more detail, but I would highly recommend that.
Well, maybe we can look at it when the trade comes out.
Yeah, and that's a possibility. I want to mention a couple of others, and I don't have time to go over all of these, but a couple of others that really stood out to me. And one was issue number 1 of Joe Gollum. This is written by Mike Mignola and Christopher Golden with art by Patrick Reynolds. This is another one that Kunk and I had mentioned in a preview show. I don't know, are you familiar with the Joe Gollum narrative?
Just, very, very limited knowledge of what it is. I have not picked up any of those yet.
I haven't either, but this began as an illustrated novel, a project between Mignola and Golden. Mm-hmm. And so now what they're doing is taking that prose with illustrations version of Joe Gollum, or at least the setting and the character, and creating a comic. So this is the first of 3. So this story arc is called The Rat, or at least this issue is called The Ratcatcher. I'm not sure if this is the name of this issue or the story arc, but it's one of 3, and I'm hoping that we get more, because this first issue of Joe Gollum blows me away. It has, even though it's not illustrated by Mignola, it does have that dark Hellboy feel to it. Mm. And it does deal with, as the name suggests, a golem of some sort. And again, I'm not familiar with the character of Joe Golem from the earlier books, but I can get a sense that Joe Golem, the detective, is linked to a golem. And we get a little setup here. I'm assuming that I'll be filled in on more information in the next 1 or 2 issues.
Yeah, I'll have to check that out.
That's definitely one worth looking at. And the other one that I'll mention, and I loved, and I didn't know what to expect, is Garth Ennis's and Keith Burns's Johnny Red. And what Ennis is doing here is he's taking, I believe this is a character that had been visited in earlier comics, not by Ennis, but we know that Ennis has an intense interest in war comics. Mm-hmm. And so this is very much like this. Now, this is published by Titan, and it's a great setup. I really enjoy war comics, and specifically, this is an aviation war comic. But it's not that I seek them out, and part of the reason for that is there are just not that many that are being published. In fact, when you talk about contemporary war comics, Garth Ennis and his war stories, that's basically it. I mean, there are a few others, but that's more or less what you have right now. But when I was growing up, I was a big fan of war stories. Sergeant Rock, Weird War Tales, titles like that, Haunted Tank. But so we don't find many now, and that's one of the things that makes this first issue so refreshing. But the way that Ennis handles the Johnny Red character is really impressive. This is one of those series I would like to go on to read, if not in single issues, then once it's collected. That just reminds me that I really enjoyed, this has been several years ago, but Ennis did I guess it was a standalone called Enemy Ace, War in Heaven. Mm-hmm. And of course, Enemy Ace was a Joe Kubert title that I really, really love. Right. And I really liked Ennis's take on Enemy Ace. So this sounds like something I would like as well. But like you said, there's not that many war comics out there. So it's good to see another one there. Yeah, there are just so many good things. I mean, I could have talked more about Citizen Jack by Sam Humphries and Tommy Patterson. I mean, these are just a lot of really, really good #1 issues. But we only had so much time on the show.
That's right. And, it's Derek, this is a huge problem. I mean, you go to the comic shop, and even if you did limit yourself to non-superhero titles, which we're not saying you should, but even if you did say, I'm just going to look at the non-superhero titles, there are so many to choose from. And like you said, we just scratched the surface today.
Well, Andy, that surface that we scratched was composed of Paper Girls by Brian K. Vaughan and Cliff Chang, Monstrous by Marjorie Liu and Sana Takeda, The Goddamned, written by Jason Aaron, art by R.M. Guerra, Klaus, Grant Morrison and Dan Mora, Snowblind, Ollie Masters and Tyler Jenkins, and James Bond, Warren Ellis, illustrated by Jason Masters. So a lot of comics that we discussed for today.
Yep, a lot of titles. I hope there's something of interest to everyone and that you enjoy those.
That's right. And if you want to pre-order future issues of the comics we discussed today, then head on over to the website of our sponsor. And our sponsor is Discount Comic Book Service. So if you go to dcbservice.com, you're going to find incredible specials. And you can also find a lot of great books by visiting Amazon.com. And in fact, if you do get your books or other stuff through Amazon.com, what you can do is go through our website. So if you type in your browser comicsalternative.com/Amazon, you'll see our icon that tells you to get your Amazon stuff through us. Click on that, and anything you get through Amazon, books or otherwise, via that click-through, we get a few cents kickback.
That's right, and every bit helps, so
exactly.
Don't forget about us.
Don't forget about us. And it takes a little bit away from Jeff Bezos, but he has more than he knows what to do with already.
That's for sure.
And after you do get your comics at either DCB Service or through Amazon.com, through our associate link, get in touch with us and let us know the kind of things you're going to be reading. If you go to the website, comicsalternative.com, you'll see a button that says Start Recording. Click on that, and from the comfort of your own desktop or mobile device, you can send us a voice message. Or you can call us the old-fashioned way. The phone number is 415-3-COMICS. That's 415-326-6427.
And for the latest news on what we're all about, that includes updates to the website and the podcast, you can go to Twitter and you can follow us. We are at the number 2 guys with PhDs, and we appreciate everybody that retweets and spreads the word of everything that we're up to.
That's right. You can also email us. We're 2guys at comicsalternative.com. I'm Derek at comicsalternative.com. And if people want to contact you directly, Andy, because you're hating on Santa Claus, how can they get in touch with you?
They can contact me at bagofcoal.com. No, seriously, you can contact me at Wolverton at comicsalternative.com.
That's right. And you can also find us on Facebook, on Tumblr, on Instagram, on Google+, on Pinterest, and on YouTube. You can subscribe to the podcast through iTunes, and when you do, please leave us a rating and review. We'd appreciate that. You can also stream us on Stitcher, and you can find us on TuneIn. And as always, you can find every single one of our episodes, as well as our reviews and the comics-related commentary that we post on our blog. And that's at the website, comicsalternative.com.
That's right. And Derek, I think we've got a Thanksgiving episode coming up pretty soon, right?
That's right. And we're not exactly sure how we're going to do or when we're going to do the Thanksgiving show, but there will be at least 2 of us, maybe 3. We don't know. We still need to make plans, where we get together and talk about what we're thankful for in the world of comics.
Yeah, maybe there will be turkey.
Yes, maybe
Good.
So.
Maybe.
So get ready, get your appetite all honed, and until then, I'm Derek.
And I'm Andy.
See you later. He handles female protagonists very well here. The premise of this is black magic. Magic is spelled M-A-G-I-C-K. This is the story of a police officer by the name of her last name is Black. What is her first? It starts with an R. I'm blanking here on her first name, but it does start with an R. And as this issue opens, we see that there's some kind of coven. There's some ceremony taking place out in the forest, and it has everything to do with witches and black magic. And in the middle of this ceremony, someone's cell phone goes off, and it happens to be our protagonist, Officer Black. So she says that someone better have died for this to be an interruption. And in fact, what she finds is she's called away to a hostage situation. And what we have is someone who has gone into a diner, a place, a burger joint, and has taken several hostages. And the reason why he's taken them is he specifically wants to talk to Black. And in fact, her first name is Rowena, I think it is, but she's called Ro, so Ro Black. And he asks for her, and things are very suspicious. They're wondering why this is the case. So once he gets Ro Black into the diner, he lets the other hostages go, and we get to see why it is her in particular that he wanted to speak with, why he did what he did in order to get him or get her into the diner with him. And I won't give anything else away because what we find out in the final pages really sets up what I'm sure will unfold in the next issue or two to come. So this is a great series. It's one that I wish we had time to discuss in more detail, but I would highly recommend that.
Well, maybe we can look at it when the trade comes out.
Yeah, and that's a possibility. I want to mention a couple of others, and I'll have time to go over all of these, but a couple of others that really stood out to me. And one was issue number 1 of Joe Gollum. This is written by Mike Mignola and Christopher Golden with art by Patrick Reynolds. This is another one that Kunk and I had mentioned in a preview show. I don't know, are you familiar with the Joe Gollum narrative?
Just, very, very limited knowledge of what it is. I have not picked up any of those yet.
I haven't either, but this began as an illustrated novel, a project between Mignola and Golden. Mm-hmm. And so now what they're doing is taking that prose with illustrations version of Joe Gollum, or at least the setting and the character, and creating a comic. So this is the first of 3. So this story arc is called The Rat, or at least this issue is called The Ratcatcher. I'm not sure if this is the name of this issue or the story arc, but it's one of 3, and I'm hoping that we get more because this first issue of Joe Gollum blows me away. It has, even though it's not illustrated by Mignola, it does have that dark Hellboy feel to it. Okay. And it does deal with, as the name suggests, a golem of some sort. And again, I'm not familiar with the character of Joe Gollum from the earlier books, but I can get a sense that Joe Gollum, the detective, is linked to a golem. And we get a little setup here. I'm assuming that I'll be filled in on more information in the next 1 or 2 issues.
Yeah, I'll have to check that out.
That's definitely one worth looking at. And the other one that I'll mention, and I loved, and I didn't know what to expect, is Garth Ennis's and Keith Burns's Johnny Red. And what Ennis is doing here is he's taking, I believe this is a character that had been visited in earlier comics, not by Ennis, but we know that Ennis has an intense interest in war comics. Mm-hmm. And so this is very much like this. Now, this is published by Titan, and it's a great setup. I really enjoy war comics, and specifically this is an aviation war comic. But it's not that I seek them out, and part of the reason for that is there are just not that many that are being published. In fact, when you talk about contemporary war comics, Garth Ennis and his war stories, that's basically it. I mean, there are a few others, but that's more or less what you have right now. But when I was growing up, I was a big fan of war stories. Sergeant Rock, Weird War Tales, titles like that, Haunted Tank. But so we don't find many now, and that's one of the things that makes this first issue so refreshing. But the way that Ennis handles the Johnny Red character is really impressive. This is one of those series I would like to go on to read, if not in single issues, then once it's collected. That just reminds me that I really enjoyed, this has been several years ago, but Ennis did I guess it was a standalone called Enemy Ace, War in Heaven. Mm-hmm. And of course, Enemy Ace was a Joe Kubert title that I really, really love. Right. And I really liked Ennis's take on Enemy Ace. So this sounds like something I would like as well. But like you said, there's not that many war comics out there. So it's good to see another one there. Yeah, there are just so many good things. I mean, I could have talked more about Citizen Jack by Sam Humphries and Tommy Patterson. I mean, these are just a lot of really, really good #1 issues. But we only had so much time on the show.
That's right. And, it's Derek, this is a huge problem. I mean, you go to the comic shop, and even if you did limit yourself to non-superhero titles, which we're not saying you should, but even if you did say, I'm just going to look at the non-superhero titles, there are so many to choose from. And like you said, we just scratched the surface today.
Well, Andy, that surface that we scratched was composed of Paper Girls by Brian K. Vaughan and Cliff Chang, Monstrous by Marjorie Liu and Sana Takeda, The Goddamned, written by Jason Aaron, art by R.M. Guerra, Klaus, Grant Morrison and Dan Mora, Snowblind, Ollie Masters and Tyler Jenkins, and James Bond, Warren Ellis, illustrated by Jason Masters. So a lot of comics that we discussed for today.
Yep, a lot of titles. I hope there's something of interest to everyone and that you enjoy those.
That's right. And if you want to pre-order future issues of the comics we discussed today, then head on over to the website of our sponsor. And our sponsor is Discount Comic Book Service. So if you go to dcbservice.com, you're going to find incredible specials. And you can also find a lot of great books by visiting Amazon.com. And in fact, if you do get your books or other stuff through Amazon.com, what you can do is go through our website. So if you type in your browser comicsalternative.com/Amazon, you'll see our icon that tells you to get your Amazon stuff through us. Click on that, and anything you get through Amazon, books or otherwise, via that click-through, we get a few cents kickback.
That's right, and every bit helps, so
exactly.
Don't forget about us.
Don't forget about us. And it takes a little bit away from Jeff Bezos, but he has more than he knows what to do with already.
That's for sure.
And after you do get your comics at either DCB Service or through Amazon.com, through our associate link, get in touch with us and let us know the kind of things you're going to be reading. If you go to the website, comicsalternative.com, you'll see a button that says Start Recording. Click on that, and from the comfort of your own desktop or mobile device, you can send us a voice message. Or you can call us the old-fashioned way. The phone number is 415-3-COMICS. That's 415-326-6427.
And for the latest news on what we're all about, that includes updates to the website and the podcast, you can go to Twitter and you can follow us. We are at the number 2 guys with PhDs, and we appreciate everybody that retweets and spreads the word of everything that we're up to.
That's right. You can also email us. We're 2 guys at comicsalternative.com. I'm Derek at comicsalternative.com. And if people want to contact you directly, Andy, because you're hating on Santa Claus, how can they get in touch with you?
They can contact me at bagofcoal.com. No, seriously, you can contact me at Wolverton at comicsalternative.com.
That's right. And you can also find us on Facebook, on Tumblr, on Instagram, on Google+, on Pinterest, and on YouTube. You can subscribe to the podcast through iTunes, and when you do, please leave us a rating and review. We'd appreciate that. You can also stream us on Stitcher, and you can find us on TuneIn. And as always, you can find every single one of our episodes, as well as our reviews and the comics-related commentary that we post on our blog. And that's at the website, comicsalternative.com.
That's right. And Derek, we've got I think we've got a Thanksgiving episode coming up pretty soon, right?
That's right. And we're not exactly sure how we're going to do or when we're going to do the Thanksgiving show, but there will be at least 2 of us, maybe 3. We don't know. We still need to make plans, where we get together and talk about what we're thankful for in the world of comics.
Yeah, maybe there will be turkey.
Yes, maybe
Good.
So.
Maybe.
So get ready, get your appetite all honed, and until then, I'm Derek.
And I'm Andy.
See you later.